if we're being honest, authentic, and complex in our conversations about racism, we will likely experience some discomfort. And what I will argue is that there is growth in that discomfort, and ask you to not run from it, but to sit in it and figure out why you're experiencing that discomfort, and what is it that you need to learn or talk about or discuss or reflect on to help you move forward. I'm also not seeking your agreement or approval. I'm not here to prove anything to you. I'm here to share what I've learned, and I'm actively invested in your growth around these issues and your thinking around these issues. My goal is not to have you believe what I believe. I'm not here to indoctrinate you. My goal is, again, to support your journey in establishing your own beliefs and interrogating your own beliefs. I'm also not seeking to offer resolution and perhaps not even clarity. I'd like for us to focus instead on unraveling, complicating things, getting a little bit messy. I'll raise questions today and give points for you to consider that I believe are the basis of people who have an informed and critically engaged point of view about racism. This will undoubtedly require more time and reading and reflection and discussion than we have today. So you may leave not feeling resolved or clear, but maybe in a state of reflection. Racism must be framed and understood as being multidimensional. It's not one thing. It's not just something that happens between people. It exists in our structures and systems and in our cultures. And when we're thinking about this intersection of empathy, racism, and race, it's important for us to think about that it's not just about relationships between us. It's about how these things manifest as a part of our socio-cultural fabric. We also can't meaningfully engage racism without saying the word racism. I'm going to say it a lot today. I can see people squirm in their seats when I say the word racism. But it's important for us to not dilute it with words that make you or others more comfortable. It's important to name what it is that we're talking about. It's also important that when we're talking about racism, which is tied to my conversation around empathy, that we name whiteness. It's not invisible in our conversations about race and racism, and it's important for us to name. At the intersections of empathy, race, and racism, we must consider not only the feelings and experiences of others. We've talked a lot about that this week. We must also see ourselves, perhaps more clearly because of our attempts to see and understand others. And to remember that emotion, individual experiences, and perspectives are never divorced from vast social, political, and cultural context. Empathy is not just personal, it is social and political. And I hope to unpack that a bit with you today. Virtual reality is the ultimate empathy machine. Chris Milk, who is a prominent VR creator, I think he probably regrets saying this because it's a quote that gets used all the time. But VR is seen as this powerful machine that can transport you to different worlds and put you into experiences that you couldn't possibly experience otherwise. Raise of hand, who has experienced virtual reality before? You've had on a headset. Did your grandchildren convince you to put this on and fly a plane or fly through the sky? When I started this work in virtual reality, I had never even had a headset on my head. I barely understood what it was. But I wanted to build on this adage of walking a mile in someone's shoes. If you could just walk a mile in my shoes, might you understand racism differently than me just explaining it to you or you just reading about it? If I could put you into an experience where you weren't an observer, you were actually having it happen to you. A first-person point of view, a front seat to an experience of racism. Might that change the ways in which people engaged? And ultimately, that's empathy, right? That's a tool, a mechanism to get us to empathy. But I've also reached this point where I had to question whether empathy was sufficient. Is simply understanding the perspective of someone experiencing racism enough? I've also had to question whether racial empathy was possible. Can 10 minutes in a headset really help you understand the perspective and emotions of someone going through this sort of experience? Where I've landed is that achieving racial justice requires that we understand racism. not an understanding that emerges from intellectual exercise or even in the consumption or production of science, which is where my work sits most of the time, but rather a visceral understanding that connects to spirit and body as much as reason. And my exploration was considering whether virtual reality could give us that sort of visceral connection with racism. When we think about racism, we're not only thinking about sort of abstract ideas or experiences or things that are far removed from us. I like Ta-Nehisi's Coates' reflection on this, where he says, but for all of our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it lodges brains, blocks airways, tips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must always remember the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. And if we are invested in some notion of racial justice, we need to connect with that. We need to connect with the reality of that. What we find empirically is that white people in particular don't understand racism. And I know it can make white people uncomfortable to be named as a group. When we talk about race, we're talking about the marginalized, we're talking about the oppressed. But white people in our reflections and dealing with the realities of racism have a stake in this as well. And when we measure and ask them, how much do you think racial injustice is a factor in our society, they misestimate significantly. How big do you think the racial wealth gap is? The racial wealth gap, according to our data, will be this. Consistently, white people, and actually people in general, will think it's this. We overestimate racial progress. We're all doing fine, right? We're doing okay. Things are not as bad as they used to be. So there's this tendency to misrepresent what racism is and just how little we've gained in terms of racial equity in our society.